For decades, various Western think tanks and leaders have been warning that Russia has designs on invading and seizing the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. This exact threat was the primary motive behind the three states joining NATO in March 2004. Russia's subsequent invasion of Ukraine, combined with the three states' unwavering support for Ukraine throughout the conflict, has only sharpened those fears. As a result, all three nations, in conjunction with fellow NATO members, have taken several steps to prevent or disrupt any such invasion. But not content with the extent of that protection, Lithuania went a step further and announced plans for the most concrete and comprehensive defensive measures yet: a 30-mile defensive belt all along its borders with Russia and Russia's ally, Belarus. Let's take a closer look at their defensive plans and why they're important. The reason for the Baltic states' high alert about a possible Russian invasion is, of course, the fact that, other than Finland, they're the only NATO members that share a border with Russia. Estonia's border is roughly 200 miles long, although some 2/5 of that is demarcated by lakes, not land. Latvia shares an approximately 183-mile border with Russia, and a further 106-mile border with Belarus. Lithuania, for its part, shares a 422-mile border with Belarus and a roughly 170-mile-long border with the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which is wedged between it and Poland to its south. Importantly, the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius is only 21 miles down the E28 highway from the Belarus border. That positions it as prime low-hanging fruit in the event of a Russian invasion. But in the Lithuanian plan unveiled by Defense Minister Dovilė Šakalienė in August 2025, the capital will be behind a 30-mile deep belt of layered defenses. In some circles, the plan to build such a defensive line was criticized as a 21st-century version of the doomed Maginot Line, but that comparison is not really accurate. The Maginot Line was a network of concrete fortifications, obstacles, and weapons installations built by France between 1929 and 1938 along its border with Germany to deter invasion by the Nazis. It stretched from Switzerland to Luxembourg, covering a distance of approximately 280 miles, and was designed to be impervious to most forms of attack, including aerial bombing and tank fire. The fortifications were built using thick concrete and massive amounts of steel, with extensive underground passages, air-conditioned living quarters, recreation areas, supply storehouses, and an internal network of narrow-gauge railways to resupply the fortresses. French military planners believed the Maginot Line would deter German aggression by slowing an invasion force long enough for the French army to mobilize and counterattack, allowing for a more effective defense. The line was organized as a defense in depth, featuring forward-listening posts that would sound the alarm and delay an enemy before falling back to the main fortifications. However, despite its advanced design and formidable defenses, the Maginot Line ultimately failed to prevent the German invasion of France in 1940. German forces simply bypassed it by invading through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, a region the French considered impassable for large military forces due to its dense terrain and lack of roads. This maneuver, known as Fall Gelb, which translates to Case Yellow, allowed the Germans to encircle the French and Allied armies, leading to the capture of over 500,000 prisoners and the eventual fall of France. Ultimately, the line's failure was not due to a lack of strength, but because it did not extend to the Belgian border, and French strategy had not anticipated a German attack through Belgium, which was not fortified. Lithuania did not plan on making the same mistake. The plans unveiled for the Lithuanian defense line cover the entire border, stretching from the Latvian border in the northeast all the way down to the Belarus-Poland border in the south, and right across the border with Kaliningrad. In fact, the only part of Lithuania's eastern and southern flanks not covered by this defensive line is the 65-mile-long border with Poland, the so-called Suwalki Gap. Building a massive, multi-layered defensive belt to block the primary road route linking Lithuania, and indeed the other Baltic states, with NATO allies would be counterproductive, to say the least. With the Suwalki Gap already heavily defended by NATO forces, it means there had to be any gaps in the defensive line for the Russians to exploit if they invade, unlike with the Maginot Line. Furthermore, the Ukraine war has proven the effectiveness of multi-layered defensive belts on the modern battlefield. Lithuania's defensive belt was conceived in no small part based on the Ukrainians' successes in holding back Russian offensives using similar lines. Ukraine's defensive belts have been very successful in forcing the Russians to advance at a snail's pace and with high losses. However, these defenses have themselves been largely based on Russia's defensive belt in southeastern Ukraine in 2023, which Ukraine was ultimately unable to breach. This defensive line was dubbed the Surovikin Line, after the notorious Russian general Sergei Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon, who had ordered and overseen its construction. He had commanded the southern grouping of Russian forces for the initial invasion into Ukraine, and became the commander of all Russian forces in Ukraine from October 2022 until September 2023. Following the failed Wagner PMC coup attempt in June 2023, Surovikin was relieved of his duties and was rumored to be involved in Russian and/or Wagner operations in Africa. But his defensive lines undoubtedly changed the momentum of the war. Throughout late 2022 and early 2023, the Ukrainians had successfully pushed the Russians out of Kharkiv and key settlements in the Donbass, and had amassed a massive force in the southeast. Replete with advanced NATO weaponry like Abrams tanks and Bradley armored fighting vehicles, this force aimed to retake Russian-occupied territory in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions and push all the way to Crimea. But it ran headfirst into a brick wall in the Surovikin Line, causing the counteroffensive to fail with substantial losses in manpower and equipment. Besides, Ukraine's foray into Russia's Kursk region, also eventually repelled after 8 months, the front line began moving steadily westwards. The Surovikin Line, which still stands today, spans approximately 81 miles, extending from Vasilivka in Zaporizhzhia Oblast to Volnovakha in Donetsk Oblast. It consists of 3 layers of various obstacles and fighting positions, fronted by sprawling minefields which the Ukrainians had to try and navigate before even reaching the first line. The first actual layer is an anti-vehicle ditch that's designed to prevent tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and other heavy armor from advancing. The second layer is a row of dragon's teeth, concrete spikes also intended to stop vehicles. The third layer consists of trenches manned by Russian soldiers who can observe the ditches and the dragon's teeth from their fighting positions. In between each layer are additional minefields. And wherever possible, the third layer fighting positions are built in elevated positions to enhance battlefield awareness and improve the effectiveness of counteroffensive measures like artillery strikes. The strategy worked, with Ukrainian forces only able to temporarily puncture holes through the minefields and into the first line of defense in a handful of villages, before ultimately being forced back. The Surovikin Line had succeeded where the Maginot Line had failed. In the aftermath of the failed Zaporizhzhia counteroffensive, Ukraine moved into a strategy it called active defense, enhancing its already substantial defensive fortifications with a kind of Surovikin line of its own. By early 2024, row upon row of freshly dug trenches, concrete dragon's teeth, and underground command centers sprang up along key segments of the more than 621 miles of front lines. In particular, defensive preparations were boosted around the Donetsk towns of Lyman and Avdiivka, as well as in front of Kupiansk in the neighboring Kharkiv region. The construction of fortifications, based on the same 3-layered system of trenches, tank traps, and strongpoints preceded by minefields, was also ordered along the borders with Russia and Belarus, all the way to the Polish border. Deeper into Ukrainian-held territory, a maze of fallback positions was also built, consisting of trench networks and new dug-in command centers. The city of Pokrovsk, for example, which Russia has been unsuccessfully trying to capture for most of 2025, is defended by a two-layered trench system running all around the city. In front of and around key cities like Pokrovsk and Liman, Ukraine has placed a series of fortifications less than a mile apart. As Clément Moulin, co-founder of the French Atom Mundi organization, put it, each fort can defend itself from every direction. You have to take all of them to advance. Russia eventually, and at very high cost, managed to take Avdiivka and the similarly fortified Bakhmut and Toretsk. However, in other areas of the front, the Ukrainian lines provided unbreakable resistance. In the Sumy region, for example, Russia's attempts to create a buffer zone along its border to prevent daily Ukrainian drone attacks and the possibility of another incursion like the one in Kursk stalled at the first line of Ukrainian defensive fortifications. All of the lessons learned from both the Russian and Ukrainian Surovikin lines have clearly been absorbed into Lithuania's plan for a defensive belt of its own. Indeed, similar strategies are also being put in place in Estonia, Latvia, and Poland.